G'day. This is a tip for adding flavour and interest to your D&D campaigns when your party is travelling through the wilderness. And it's one of those almost a no-brainer tips that when you think about it, you kind of go, yeah, why haven't I been doing that? So I've played lots of D&D and I have seen lots of the online stuff like Critical Role, and something that you almost never see featured in wilderness travel is weather. There's a little bit of information about it in the DM's guide. There's some sort of suggestions, and it basically covers really adverse weather, but you don't see much other than that unless the party is traveling to particular climates. You might get deserty weather in the desert, or you might go to the Arctic regions or up in the mountains and you'll see snow and ice up there. But for the most part, everything's just sort of springish. The days tend to be fairly bright, unless you get those really weird things where, you know, a particular rain or storm is built into a section of the campaign, which I've seen in some campaigns. You just don't really see weather feature a lot. But I think we really miss out by skipping that as an element of the gameplay in the wilderness. So let me just quickly try and sell you on the idea of weather. For the first thing, it is super thematic. Not just wandering through. You might have wandering monsters pop up occasionally, and there might be discussions of food, and there might be discussions of how you travel and whether you use horses and things like that. But adding an extra element that is, when they're traveling, suddenly they end up with just deluge rain pouring down on them, and suddenly the party is getting soaked to the skin, and you're suddenly getting questions of, where are we sleeping? Are we finding a cave? Do we have a tent? Does someone have a spell that can protect them? If someone has shape water as a cantrip, are they summoning themselves a mystical umbrella, and are they doing it for other people or just for themselves? And suddenly that introduces a party dynamic. If you are traveling to abandoned ruins, or if someone comes across a looted wagon with, you know, dead bodies around, how much more thematic if that's happening in really thick fog when you come across the looted wagon and there's this sense of, we don't know how long these people have been dead for and we don't know if things are around. If you can only see maybe 30 feet because the fog is so thick, how much creepier does that make it? It also can make gameplay a lot more interesting and complex if you make use of some of those things. So, for example, if you are getting thick fog or heavy rain, does that introduce an element where your ranges on all your weapons are halved? Or maybe there's a cap on how far you can shoot, that if you're in fog, maybe no matter what the proper range of your weapon is, it's 30-60 in this because you can only see so far. On really clear weather, we don't necessarily think of really bright sunny weather having an effect on play, but what if on a really clear day, stealth has a disadvantage because a thief is just not able to hide? If you hide behind a rock in bright sunlight, people can go, well, there he is. What about if when you're in the middle of an absolute deluge and it's been raining for 2 days straight, if all the ground is turning to slush? And so if you're fighting in that, suddenly everyone's in difficult terrain unless you have some kind of way to fly or float above the ground, or you have some special ability. There's also elements of, can you use special tactics in those situations? So there's a cantrip that allows you to turn any patch of ground into difficult terrain, or if it's difficult terrain, make it easier to navigate. In really heavy weather, can you do that with the shape water cantrip? Because it allows you to freeze an area 5 foot square. Could you instantly do that to the slush on the ground, and suddenly that's difficult terrain because people are slipping over on it? Do you have resistance or vulnerability in certain weather conditions? If you've been rained on for 3 days and your party is drenched to the skin, does that give you advantage against fire attacks, or does that give you resistance to fire damage? But conversely, because you are wet to the skin and you are already probably freezing cold, could that potentially give you vulnerability to cold damage? you could play with a lot of these ideas of the weather isn't just a thematic effect. It actually affects gameplay and changes how combat goes and things like that. Now, the rules for it could be super simple. It might just be a matter of you roll a d6, and on a 6 you get adverse weather. And then you might roll another d6 that is just bright sun, wind, rain, a thunderstorm, which makes it hard to hear things, which is great if you're trying to break into a castle or something like that, fog limiting visibility, or maybe a 6 or a 1 is just an absolute tempest of a storm that has everything on tap. Thunder, lightning, rain, hail, all that sort of stuff. Maybe that's the storm. It could be a little bit more complicated, so you could do something a bit like the random encounter tables. You might roll a d20 for what the weather is like, and that means as your party is going along, you can kind of say, it's cloudy today, it's not too bad, but, because you've rolled an 8, But maybe you have secondary tables that happen when you roll maybe a 1 to 4 or a 17 to 20, that have different effects. And that's where your rain and your hail and your incredibly sunny weather come out. Or it could be something that has whole different tables for seasons. I very rarely see the seasons come into play in wilderness gameplay, but do you track what season the players are in? And over the course of the time, it actually changes the weather effects. You are starting to get into snow as you get into winter, or you are starting to get into drizzling rain as you get into spring or something like that. It just makes travel more interesting, more thematic, and potentially far more memorable. You could have those moments where you're camping at night and you've randomly rolled fog and you're making the characters roll perception checks, and they don't know if that's because you've rolled that there's wolves out there in the wilderness, or if you're just making them roll and there is nothing out there but they're just spooking out, or they're coming across the cart in the wilderness in pouring rain and they don't know if there's enemies nearby because they wouldn't be able to hear. Or you can make these things really memorable and really cool. And sure, there's lots of times that you'll roll just an average day, sunny day, but for every one of those, maybe there'll be something that you get this, we're trudging through the rain and there's a whole heap of all the characters being snippy with one another, or a thief is caught because everything is too bright and you can't hide. I think we miss out so much if we don't bother just taking a moment to say, all right, what's the weather like today when the characters get up in the morning? So yeah, throw some weather into your games. Make that a feature of wilderness travel. Tell them what the weather is like. If nothing else, it just adds a little bit more interest and theme and description to their travel than just you travel along and the horses are fine and you travel a day's worth of travel and then camp. I would love to hear your thoughts or your comments. Just drop them in the comments section. Thanks for listening.